With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Lamed Gimel. We left off on Daf Lamed Beis, Amid Beis, the last line in the Amid. We are learning about temporary construction, binyan aray, how it's asur, how it's only asur midrabanan, which is why there are exceptions when it comes to human dignity. And we're going to learn, since it's only asur midrabanan, that if you make a deviation, if you make a shinui, if you build in the opposite way, like many other rabbinic rules, that the moment you make a shinui, it becomes mutter lachatchila. And this gewaldige concept of that God builds milmayla lamata. Of course, because the Eibishter began kaviyachol lamayla, from Shemayim, right? From Atzilus, Bria, Yitzira, and then you have Asiyah. People here, we build milmata lamayla. And even physically, when you build a building, you begin with the lower part, and then you go to the higher part. So since binyan aray is only asur midrabanan, we're going to learn, if you make a shinui by building milmayla lamata. So for example, the case we had on the Mishnah was, you may not bring two barrels near each other, and then put a pot on top, and you're going to put the source of fire in between the two barrels. So the two barrels serve, number one, as a holder for the pot, and as an area where the heat is retained. But what happens if you're going to hold the pot on top? Someone has to hold the handle, and then someone else brings the two barrels underneath it. That will be the concept of building milmayla lamata. And other such examples, we will see that will be permitted. Even though we already mentioned, but that Daf Lamed Gimel Beitzah is where we introduce the concept of Eitzim Lo Nitnu Ela Lahasaka. That's a very big statement. And it's all based l'chora that in those days, today we have so many kalim, and everything is easy to get, and everything is disposable. In those days, you didn't have tools, you didn't have any kalim. People would give they would get biyarusha, a couple of plates and cups. So wood was the easiest item that people would end up using for all sorts of things, including they would take a log and they would turn it into something which is asur because you're being mesaken mana on Yom Tov. So there came a time, according to some opinions, that Chazal said all wood is by default muktzah. You can only move it on Yom Tov if you need fuel. And that will be a way to understand various halachas that we had on the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Beis, Amid Beis. We're going to have a Mishnah on Daf Lamed Gimel, Amid Aleph, like we had already in the last year, with many specific dinim, which will all be explained in the Daf. But I just want to mention one of them in the introduction, because that's a huge topic. It is here that the Mishnah introduces that on Yom Tov you may not create fire. And that's the big issue. Now, of course, on Shabbos you may not create fire. The Torah says, Lo yisavaru eish b'chol ma'ishvosechem, from all the lamatas malachis. Clearly, that's one that havara, whether it's lachalik lalav or whether it's to be machalik the malachis, havara is clear. Carrying is noch hamachloikes, whether the loiseitzu is concerning tchum, whether it's concerning carrying by the mana. But be that as it may, on Yom Tov, for oichol nefesh, you for sure we're making fire. The Mishnah says that you may not create a fire on Yom Tov, and as we will speak out, there's a very important machlokes rishonim, whether creating fire on Yom Tov is an isur d'oraisa or it's an isur d'rabbanan. And the big nafkamina, whether it's a d'oraisa or d'rabbanan, is whether we are allowed to tell a goy on Yom Tov to create a fire l'chadchila. If we hold that the creation of fire of Yom Tov is only an isur midrabanan, as many poskim hold, then lechatchila you can tell a goy on Yom Tov to make a fire. As many fruma people, that's what they do lechatchila. Others are machmer, at least lechatchila, to follow the rishonim that hold that making fire is an isur d'oraisa. It just makes sense. So then asking a goy, even if it's for a mitzvah, it's not a shvus the shvus. It's a amira la'akum. That's something that at least lechatchila, before Yom Tov you're going to put your oven on. Before Yom Tov you're going to put your fire on. But just to know that there are many, if b'diavad at least, if you did not do that or if it got burnt out, this is the topic where we can understand why we are allowed to ask, at least according to many rishonim, and many poskim, to a goy to create a fire for you on Yom Tov, because the isur is only isur d'rabbanan to begin with, and compounded with a shvus, compounded for a psat soirech, you're good to go. Okay, Daf Lamed Beis, Amid Beis, the last line. Amar Rav Yehuda. Now that we said that the halacha in the Mishnah, that ein makifin shtei chaviyos, is because of binyan aray. Binyan aray, building a temporary building, is only an issue that Rabbanan. So therefore he says that haimadurta, if you want to make a bonfire, and the bonfire is the same concept. How do you make a bonfire? You put logs at the ground level, then on top of it you put more logs, on top of it you put more logs. It's called a binyan. So if you want to make a bonfire on Yom Tiv, lechatchila, do it with a shinoi. How would you do it with a shinoi? Milmaylo lamata. I mean, you'll need to have a few people there. So some people are going to hold the logs that will end up being on top. Then underneath it, someone else should put logs and still hold it in their hands. Let's say you're making a 3-story, and then someone should put the logs on the bottom. It's amazing how building the way Hashem builds is called a deviation. Even though the whole reason why we don't do malach is because since God rested, we rest. Doesn't matter. But we don't build milmayla lamata, we build milmata lamaya. And similarly, it's only milmata lamayla, which is the normal method. That is what is prohibited on a rabbinic level. Daf Lamed Gimel on the top. V'chein bei'asa, when it comes to the placement of an egg. Rashi is speaking about you taking an egg and you want to place it on, look inside the top line in Rashi, in French, tripod. They would put it on some sort of tripod. And again, normally, first you put down the tripod, then on top of it you put the egg. Binyan aray. And all the Rishonim speak about, what are you talking about? It's only an egg. That's why Rashi says that it's a Beitzah gasa. It's maybe a very big egg. Maybe it's an egg that has the width of a tefach. It's anything that resembles building, even though it's not real building, might be asar midrabanan, make a shinoi, and the simple shinoi is put the egg down, then put a tripod underneath it. You're building milmayla lamata. V'chein kedera, the case of our Mishnah. The Mishnah says you may not bring 2 barrels together to put a pot. You know what? Someone should hold a pot in the air and then bring the barrels. And v'chein puriyam, the beds of those days, you had, the side posts, and then they would have some sort of canvas that they would put on top. Say that, have someone hold the canvas on top and then put the side posts underneath it. V'chein chavisa, if you're stacking barrels, same concept, all of it, as long as you do it with a shinoi, milmayla lamata, then muter lechatchila. And by the way, that goes both on Shabbos and on Yom Tiv, right? The case of the pot is only a case of Yom Tiv. But when we're speaking about other examples, it can even be, we learned this in Shabbos, right? You want to put together your bed. If it's temporary, then build it milmayla lamata. Next. Now really, this is like 2 dots, because we are referring back to the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Beis. The Mishnah says, if you have a piece of wood, you may not move it to use it to support a pot. And v'chein bedeles, nor may you move a piece of wood. It sounds like for a door. The Gemara says, bedeles salkadaitach. No one uses a piece of wood to support a door, because if something that's fixed and it's crooked and you want to align it, you put something underneath it that we get. A door opens and closes. You don't use a piece of wood to support a door. Ela ema v'chein hadeles. I got it. The Havamina was, you don't use a door to support a pot. So the Gemara says, who's going to use a door to support a pot? So the Gemara says, no, you may not move a piece of wood to support a door. That you may not do. And why not? Why not? On Yom Tiv, you can use wood for fuel. Why is wood muksa on Yom Tiv? So we quoted already when we learned the Mishnah, and now when we will learn the Sugya of that the Chazal Pashat saw that in those days, if you needed something, you needed tools, you need something to help you do what you need to do. The most common item that people would use, that they had available, were branches, were twigs, were pieces of wood, and they would rectify it, they would better it, they would make it functional for their need. That's called tikkun mana. They would be making a utensil. And the only way they felt you can stop it is they made a very big ban that you can only move wood. Now on Shabbos, never, because on Shabbos you're not allowed to cook. Even on Yom Tov, yeah, for cooking, fine. But other than for fuel, you may not move wood. That is the author of our Mishnah. And indeed, you may not support a pot by using a bekas, a piece of wood. You cannot support a door by using a piece of wood. Why? There came a time that the sages only allowed for you to move pieces of wood if you are going to use it for fuel. If it's not for fuel, then you might end up using it, making a handle out of it, using it for something else by rectifying it. Tikkun mana. However,
you can't use it for a door stop, not a door stop.
Very good example. Very good example. That's exactly so. A piece of wood is good for a doorstop. So our Tana holds you may not do it. Why? Because you might end up, let's say, like you said, a doorstop. Sometimes the wood doesn't fit, so you want to level it out. You want to better it. You're gonna end up making it into a tool. However, not everyone agrees to that. Rab Shimon argues. I want you to know, B'chlal, we paskin like Rab Shimon when it comes to these dinim. As we'll see soon, actually Rashi writes that clearly. Rab Shimon is matter because, no, of course, if you want to use it into a doorstop and you want to rectify it, that you're not allowed to do. But if you're not rectifying it, wood and Yom Tov is good for fuel. Wood is not muktzah to begin with. So if you want to use it to support, no problem. You have a chair, the chair is crooked, or the table is, rickety, and you want to put something on one side, all of that, that's the question. Machlokes Tanoim. Next thing that we had in the Mishnah, the ein manhigenes abehema b'makel. You may not drive an animal with a stick. The sticks that were made to drive animals on Yom Tov. However, this is all quoting our Mishnah that Rabbi Elazar, but Rab Shimon matir. Now, what's the machlokes here? So perhaps suggest the Gemara that Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon is following the shita of his father. In other words, maybe the issue is an issue of muktzah. The broader application of muktzah, the more limited application of muktzah, maybe such a stick, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is muktzah, and according to Rab Shimon is not muktzah. In other words, according to Rabbi Yehuda, people normally, even if they would have to move their animals about a little bit, would not need such a stick. Those sticks were needed for a long distance drive, a long distance trek that you're not doing on Yom Tov. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's muktzah. Rabbi Shimon says no, as long as you would not be fetish, if you did not explicitly say, I won't use the stick, by default, the stick is not muktzah. Is that the argument? So the Gemara says no, loy. But how I feel Rabbi Shimon moidem. Even if you're going to follow Rab Shimon, that is generally lenient when it comes to muktzah. Here, still, other than Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon, we're going to have a problem with the stick. And why is that? Because the mechzek commando azal. It looks like, again, people would use these sticks if they would go on a long, chinga means a market. You're taking your animal to the market of animals. You're taking it to a place, and you want to show everyone how it obeys, how it goes where you want it to go, and you need to have a stick. Other than going to a marketplace, very rare that people would walk around with such a driving stick with an animal. It goes without saying, people would use it when they go on a trip, but you cannot go on a trip. We're speaking about Tchumen on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. So therefore, even according to Rab Shimon, the Tanach holds that this stick is muktzah. Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon is even more lenient. He says no. He still holds that there's no muktzah issue. Says the Gemara. Chizra. Chizra means a spit. So again, people have kalim. If you don't have a keli, you need a spit. Again, you had around, you have firewood. Can you break off? Right? Can you use a pointed branch? Not breaking. You're not making anything. Can you use a pointed branch as a spit? So Rav Nachman says it's asur. Why is it asur? Because since it was not designated to be a spit from before Yom Tov, so it's muktzah. 1 second. But you can use it for firewood. That goes back to this topic, that there are many, right, that follow this concept that shaloi nitnu eitzim elo lahasaka. Now, if before Yom Tov you made it into a keli, no problem. But if it wasn't made into a keli, they were very cautious for you using anything made out of wood. However, Absheshis Shari, if it's already a pointed branch, you're not doing anything, you're not making anything, you're just using it as is, that's okay. Now the Gemara has two versions as to where they argue. So one version says the Gemara, B'retiva, if the branch is still moist, Kulamale pligi, that it's asur, because since it was not suitable, right, before Yom Tiv to be used for anything when it is moist, that's important. Even according to Rab Shimon, it's already muksa. Ki pligi b'yabeshta, manda asar amalach. If it's dry, still le'nitnu eitzim elul hasaka. That's the sugya. Even though this can be used for firewood, only for firewood. They made as a blanket takana against using wood if it was not made into a keli prior. Uman deshari amalach. No. Mali litzlois boy, mali litzlois begachaltoi. Even if I'm going to agree that shlei nitnu eitzim elala hasaka, what does hasaka mean? Hasaka means you can only use wood for fuel. Hello, a spit. We're not using it for a door stopper. You're using it for the process of food preparation. What difference is it if you're going to put the stick in the fire or if you're going to put the food in it and put it over the fire? That's called hasaka. And therefore you're allowed to do it. That's one version. Ikeda Amri, the opposite. B'yabeshta, if this pointed branch is already dry, or it was already dry from the outset, kulamale pligi, that you are allowed to use it because you're using it for food. That's considered asaka. Ki pligi, they only argue if this pointed branch is tifta, is moist. Manda asar will say loy chazila asaka. He says, based on you can only use it for fuel, moist is not used for fuel. If you can't use it for fuel, then you can't use it for a spit. However, man the shari amalach, it's not true. If you have a very, very large fire, then you would feed it even with moist logs. So since in that scenario it's chazila hasaka, and we are saying that what's the difference if you're using it as fuel or as a spit? It's all mamish direct for food, then you are allowed. What's the halacha? Says the Gemara v'hilchasa, yabeshta shari, that only if this branch is dry, then are you allowed. And the tifta, and if it's moist, then it's asur. Why is it asur? Why is it asur? Again, now that we established that even if we're going to say that lo nitnu eitzim elala hasaka, but a spit is called hasaka, it's asur because it's not fit, right? It's not fit because it's moist for the fireplace. Says Rashi, that's only according to Rabbi Yehuda, who has this more stringent application of muksa. I'm reading inside Rashi, a couple of lines before the end of the narrow lines. Hachil chesam is only aliba demand the islay muksa. Ikba. Aval anan, says Rashi, but since we paskin like Rab Shimon, leniently, sfida lon, bein b'muksa, bein b'davar she'ein meschavin, and on the other side, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda lekula, when it comes to the question of machshiri yerchel nefesh, uchi Rabbi Yehuda machshiri yerchel nefesh. So v'chulu shari, so everything we learned, whether it's the chizra, whether you want to use a pointed branch as a spit, bein smichas kedeiros, v'akofas chaviyos, all of the dinim that we learned above, we're going to become a lot more lenient because we follow Rab Shimon, and as Rashi points out that all of them Amoraim that we had in the beginning of today and the end of yesterday, they were the Rav, or they were Talmidei the Rav. Rav paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. That's why many halachas that here are very stringent is our halachas that we won't follow. Let's go back inside the Gemara, right? Dara Shurava, we're middle of the Amit. Dara Shurava, Isha loitikanis lidiro eitz. A woman should not enter a woodshed. Litoil mehem ud, to take a piece of wood as a poker to stoke the coals. Ve'ud shenishbar, and if you have such a wood poker, if it broke, now at least you can use it for fuel. Asur lahasikoy b'Yom Tov, you may not use it. Why not? Because since when Yom Tov came in, it was then a proper coal stoker. It was designated for that. This is all following Rabbi Yehuda's broad application of muksa. Now it broke. So when it was not designated for fuel before Yom Tov, So you can't decide to use it for fuel on Yom Tov proper. Here again, like Rashi says, all of that is following Rabbi Yehuda. We don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. We paskin like Rabbi Shimon. The Mela, when it comes to Rav, like we said, Rava, did we not learn that Rava told his attendant, we learned that in the last year, that Tavali bar Avza, please, he told his attendant, roast for me a goose, and not about the shoveling out of the coals, shoveling out the oven, but here he says, V'shadei maye l'shunra, and throw the intestines to the cat. Now what's the issue? When Yom Tov came in, the goose was still alive. When the goose was still alive, it was designated for human consumption. That's one of the classical arguments between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Can you change its designation on Yom Tov? Now you're taking that part of the goose, the intestines, and you want that part of staka to be given to animals, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, you may not give it to an animal only if it was already pre-designated for animals before Yom Tov came in. So you see over here that he follows Rab Shimon. Answers the Gemara, no, even Rabbi Yehuda will admit, will be moided, that in this case, you can feed it to cats. That's just an example on Yom Tov, because given the misrichi, since intestines will spoil, so you who planned before Yom Tov to shecht your goose on Yom Tov, lechatchila, you already planned to take those parts of the goose that will not remain fresh until afterwards, that can only serve a purpose of it becoming animal food. And from esmel date ilave, you already had in mind from before Yom Tov to feed that part to animals, here to cats, which is why it's not muktzeh, even according to the Tana Rabbi Yehuda. Moving on to the next Mishnah, many details weiter. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer says, Noitalodam kesam, a person is allowed to take a sliver of wood. Mishalafanav very importantly means not only from that which is in the house, but even from that which is in his yard. And you can take it lachatzoitz boishinov to use it as a toothpick. And really we have two leniencies. Number one, like we mentioned, that you are allowed to take it even if it's in your yard. Now, who cares? Yard, house, all of these little pieces of wood or of hay are relatively difficult to gather. So one would argue that if it's not mamish in front of you, since normally you wouldn't go and do the effort of gathering it, it's like muktzah. You never plan to use it. Rabbi Eliezer holds that anything in your house and in your chatzir is considered muchan. Number two, we learned in the last Mishnah Dinim, based on the concept that what loy nitnu eitzim ela lahasaka, that wood can only be used for fuel or maybe for a spit, because Chazal felt that people are using wood for many different types of utensils, and they would actually perfect it on Yom Tov. They could potentially do so. If that would be the case, then you can't take a kesem and use it as a toothpick. So Rabbi Eliezer doesn't agree with this din. He holds that you can use wood for any purpose. Of course, you can't make it into a keli, but if it's already just a sliver of wood, it's already functional, you can use it as a toothpick. Another din, you can gather all of these slivers of wood, and again, it doesn't only go to wood, it goes to hay or to straw, and from the chatzir, that's the key, and you can use it for fuel. What would be the counter? If it's in the chatzir, since these are little items that are difficult to gather, maybe it's not called muchan, maybe it's muktzah. No, he doesn't agree to that. Not only that which is in your house, even that which is in your yard is considered muchan, and the chachamim say, I disagree with that. Only megavav mishalafanav and umadlik, two dinim. Number one, he argues with both. You can only gather wood for fire. Can't use wood if it wasn't designated as toothpicks prior to Yom Tov. You can't take wood and use it for a toothpick because they subscribe to the rule sheloi nitnu eitzim ela lahasakam. That's number one. Number two, even if you're using it for fuel, something that prior to Yom Tov, if it was not in your house, even though it was in your yard, since these are little pieces of wood, little hays, a hay that's not bound together, it's very difficult to gather it. So normally people don't even have in mind to use it for fuel prior to, and since you did not have in mind to use it, the Chachamim hold it has the status of muktzah, even though you can add to the fuel on Yom Tif, but though that hay, that sliver of wood, is already muktzah. Okay, now, next clause in the Mishnah. Ein moitziin es ha'ur. You may not produce fire on Yom Tif. That's the Mishnah. You may not produce fire. What type of creation of fire? Now, we know that once you have a pre-lit fire, you can add to it, you can take from candle number 1 and light candles ad infinitum on Yom Tov, lechatchila. But you may not create a fire. Now the Mishnah gives all types of ways of creating fire. Don't tell me I'll do it in an unusual way. Look at all of these ways. You can't create fire by using woods. You can't create fire by using stones. There were people that knew how to create fire from a certain type of earth. They made that earth spark, Rashi says. You can't do it from earth. Maybe Kevin will find a picture for that. I don't know how from earth you can create fire. Veloy min hara'afim. You may not imagine. They would take tiles, earthenware that was already burnt in a kiln. They would put the earthenware on top of fire, and we know it becomes white hot, mamish hot, and then they would put certain combustible materials on top of the tile. That would be another way that they would create fire. You can't do that. Imagine they used water to create fire. That we know already from a magnifying glass. They would use the water as the magnifying glass. So if they would have water in some sort of transparent keli, and the sun would shine through the water, and you would focus it on a leaf, they used water to create fire. You can't do that. I don't care how you are creating fire. Fire creation on Yom Tov is prohibited. And again, we're going to speak out on Amud Beis, the big machlokes all the way in the Periscope, whether it's a biblical prohibition, whether it's a rabbinic prohibition. Like we mentioned, if it's asan midoiraisa, then amira la'akum on Yom Tov will certainly be a problem. You can find a heter, but it's going to be more problematic if this din in the Mishnah of ein motzina so is only a din midrabanan. Then amira la'akum is b'chlal not a problem on Yom Tov lechatchila. Okay, now the final din in the Mishnah is, you may not make let's go back to the tile. You can't make a tile white hot, not to make fire. You want to roast on it. You may not do that. You may not put a tile on the fire to make it red hot, for you to roast on it. And the question is that why not? I'm not creating a fire. I'm taking the heat from a pre-fire. The Gemara is going to explain to you why the Chazal were afraid this is a rabbinic prohibition, and we may not do so. So let's go to the beginning. All right, says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yehuda, Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, that as we spoke out, one of the arguments between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is whether we subscribe to Shaloi Nitnu Eitzim Ela Lahasaka. Why did the Chazal make a decree that wood you can't handle? Because you might make it into a keli. What happens if the wood that you have access to is moist? It's not hard. No one would use that to make a keli. So is it still included or not included? So it says Rabbi Yehuda, Oichle behema, if something is soft enough for it to be eaten by an animal, ein bohen mishum tikkun keli, people won't use something that's soft into a keli, and therefore, let's go back to our toothpick. That will be a great example. Not a toothpick that we buy in the store that was already made for toothpicks. That, of course, is okay. We're speaking about taking a sliver of wood and you determining on Yom Tov, I want to use it as a toothpick. So you're going to say, but we learned that nitnu eitzim ela lahasaka. Says Rav Yehuda, if it's moist enough for it to be eaten by an animal, then Chazal were not afraid you're going to make it into a keli. And that is not included in this takana, and yes, you can use it as a toothpick. L'kula alma. Eisvei Rav Kana Rav Yehuda says in a Beitzah, metaltalin atzib samim, even on Shabbos, my friends, you are allowed to move fragrant woods because you want to smell them. It's not muktzah. It's fragrant wood. You're just moving it around. Similarly, you are even on Shabbos allowed to move certain woods, lahanif bahen lachayla, to wave it to someone who's ill. And it's not only that you are creating wind, but it has a good smell. Similarly, guys, this is even on Shabbos, you are allowed to roll certain woods in between your fingers that would bring out even more fragrance, and you can smell it. However, but you may not clip its top, cut off its top to smell it. Obviously, we're not speaking about a wood that's connected to the ground. That will be something that's asur d'oraisa. But here, already cutting it is, what does Rashi write? That you're making it into a keli. You know, you're starting to fashion wood. People would take wood and they would make it into something. But if you did it, pater avol asur. Why is it pater avol asur? Because your kavana was not to make it into a keli. Your kavana was to get its fragrance out. So now it's only asur midrabanan. But if your intention was to make it into a toothpick, making it into a keli, not only may you not do it, but v'im katmai chayev chatos. Now what's the problem? The problem is, see, we are not familiar with fragrant woods, but you should know, my friends, that the harder something becomes, the less fragrance it has. It's like old people, hard people, mishmek's garnished. So it's soft. If it has, it's soft. What was the chiddush of Rav Yehuda? If it's soft, how do I determine soft? Animals can eat from it. The moment it's soft, people don't make it into kalim. Stira, clearly. Gavaldik akash. Beitzah, he can't argue with the Tanach. Amalei answers the Gemara. Well, the Gemara just wants to tell you how big the question is. Rav Yehuda, in the top line, is saying that if something is soft enough to be eaten by animals, lechatchila, there is no issue of tikkun. Not even midrabanan. So Amalei, he first acknowledged that if you would have only found a Beitzah that would have said that it's pater avol asur, that already would have been a problem. Now I'm really in a corner because you found a Beitzah that said chayev chatos. That's why Rashi teaches. Like, wow, that's a big question. Mina kotza la kotza, mutar lechatchila to asur midoraisa. So it must be kitanya ahi bekoshin, that the clipping, that when we're speaking about making it into a toothpick, we're not speaking about the fragrant wood. It's not all together. You can't take a hard piece of wood and clip it into a toothpick. Taka, you're making a keli. Says the Gemara, hold on. The Beitzah was speaking about fragrant woods. If we're speaking about hard woods, b'nei menila ninu, what you think these are woods that if you roll them, some smell will come out of it? Nothing will come out of it. So we must say that you have to add to the Beitzah. That when it comes to fragrant woods, which are taka soft, and if it's still soft, then you can cut it. Your kavana is not to make it into a keli. Your kavana is to add to its fragrance. That's what you have to add in is when it's soft. Avol b'koshen, but if it's hard, like temenu, don't clip it. But if you did, so it depends what your intention is. If you clipped it, but your intention was to maybe get a little bit of good fragrance, then at least your intention was not to make it into a keli. So you violated the rabbinic, but you did not violate a biblical. But if you cut a hard piece of wood, lachtzis boishinov, you cut it because you're fashioning it into a toothpick, that's mamash and isur d'oraisa. Loik temenu, ve'im katmai, then you're chayiv chatos. Beautiful. And weiter. Tanach, we learned in one Beitzah that koitmai mariach boy. You are allowed to clip wood to smell it. Tanya idach, loik temenu l'riach boy, you're not allowed to do it. Again, how will I reconcile it? Amar abzeir Rab Chizda loik Hashem. If it's rachen, if it's soft, then the Beitzah says don't do it. Don't do it because it's still a... No. If it's soft, then you are allowed. And the Beitzah that says don't do it is because it's hard. And what's the issue? Because if it's hard, if your intention will be to make it into a toothpick, then you're violating an isur d'oraisa. So the Chachamim made a takana, even if your kavanah is not for lahariach boy, not to make it into a toothpick. Your kavanah is lahariach boy. Still, you're not allowed to do it. Maskiv lo Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Still, becaution amayloi, if your kavanah is only to smell. So what are you telling me? Since if you'll do it for a toothpick, if your kavanah will be to make it into a keli, it's taka aser doiraisa. So the chachamim made a takana that even if you're doing it lahariach by, it's also aser. Do we make such a gezerah? Do we make such a gezerah that if something can be done for two intentions, one is allowed and one is not allowed, that the chachamim say don't even do it for the right intention? Why will this be different from that which we learned to Masechta Shabbos? Mishnah. That what? That if you have dried figs that were typically kept in a barrel, you are allowed to break the barrel. These are big dinim. I know that we learned yesterday the concept of stira by kalim. So this is vitally connected to this whole topic. That here there are two reasons why we are lenient, and no one debates it. Number one is if you break a barrel, if you break a container, if you break a box, you break it in a way that you are destroying it. You're doing an act of kilkul. Number two, for food, even on Shabbos, you're not cooking, you just want to get to the food that's inside of it, that's allowed. However, so here's the kasha. Hold on. If there's an activity that if your intent is to get the food is allowed, but if your intent will be to break open the barrel now to have a receptacle, and if that's your intention, then it's a isur doiraisa. What are we saying? That if you're doing an action, that if there is a kavana that's asur midoiraisa, Chazal said don't do it even for the kavana that's mutter. So I'm back to my problem. If I have a twig that has a good fragrance and it's already getting harder, and if I'm breaking it to make it into a toothpick, if that's chayav chatos, then why? So it said so different. Don't even do it for the fragrance. They did make a takana. What's the difference? That's question number one. Question number two. Va'oid harava baravaven and Ravan barav Adam. The Amri Tarvayu that ki havinon bei Rav Yehuda when we were in the house of Rav Yehuda. Hava mefashach v'yavlon alvasa. He would have certain branches. We're speaking about branches that are not rooted in the ground. There's no koitzet here. And he gave us sticks. He gave us sticks. Afal gav the chazia lekatosa the nagre v'chatzine. Whatever he did, if one would have taken off the bark, if one would have prepared those sticks with the intent of making it into a handle of an axe, of a knife, like we mentioned, that wood was used, that was like your go-to. What do? I need a tool. Take a piece of wood. If you would have taken off the bark, if you would have cut it in a way to make it into a handle, it will be an isur doiraisa. That was not his intention. But why don't we make a takana that since there is a way, if you do it with a kavana of a keli, it's also doiraisa, you should never be allowed to do it. So the Gemara answers, like kashem, indeed, there is a machlokes whether such a gezerah is made. It's a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbanan. Which Rabbi Eliezer, which Rabbanan? The Tanya. Rabbi Eliezer oimer, noitel adam kesem mishalofanav. You are allowed to take a sliver of wood. You're not doing anything. It's already small. It was never designated to be used as a toothpick. Rabbi Eliezer holds you can take it. Lachzas by Shinov. The Chachamim hold that lo yitol. You may not take it unless it's soft, unless the wood is very soft, that you will not be able to fashion it into any keli. Ella me avus shel behemoth. That's just an example. A trough where animals drink from, that wood is filled with water, it's moist. That type of wood is not a problem. And Vishavin, they both agree, Shalo yiktemeno, don't clip a sliver of hardwood. Don't clip hardwood. The im katma, and if you did clip it, so then it's clear. Latzos by Shinov, if you did it in order to use it as a toothpick, or vilaftoich by asadeles, you need some sort of wooden pick to open up a door. That's a bona fide keli that you made on Shabbos, that you made on Yom Tiv. Then b'shoigeg b'Shabbos chayv chatos. B'mezid b'Yom Tiv soifik eswar boim. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So in other words, Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that if you did it for a keli, your chayiv chatos, did not make a takana never to do it at all. So it depends what you did it for. But there's no takana. By the way, just get off topic for a moment. The reason why by Shabbos we speak about shoygeg, and by Yom Tov we don't speak about shoygeg, when we learn Shabbos, and it's not that common that we speak about someone doing something b'mezid. Normally, when we speak about someone who broke a law of Shabbos and Yom Tov, we're speaking about a person who did it b'shoigeg and taka for Shabbos, you're chayiv chatas, right? Chayiv chatas, not chayiv skila. Even though, of course, if you did it b'mezid, God forbid, you're chayiv skila. But it's good to remember this, that on Yom Tov, just to know, there's no biblical punishment for shoigeg. You know, remember that? No, when are you chayiv chatas? You're chayiv chatas, that's the beginning of krisus. Any activity that if a person would have done it on purpose, they would be chayiv chatas, then if they did it inadvertently, the chayiv chatas. The punishment for chilul Shabbos is chatas. The punishment for chilul Yom Tov is malchus. We're not minimizing it, but it's malchus. There's no chatas for Yom Tov. There's no chiyuv chatas for the violation, for an inadvertent violation of Yom Tov. That's why Bechlal, throughout the Tanoim, when they speak about Shabbos, whenever you see the word chayiv, just when they're speaking about b'shoigeg, we would always prefer to only speak about a violator b'shoigeg. By Yom Tov we can't, because when we want to speak about the punishment, there is no punishment for shoigeg violation on Yom Tov. That's why here it's like clear in the Beitzah that the Yom Tov b'mezit shevek esar aboim. Okay. Bottom line is, according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's no gezerah at all. Chachamim oimrim, no, echad zeh ve'echad zeh, einoi ela mishum shvus. 1 second. The Chachamim hold that, they hold that even if you made it for a toothpick, even if you made it for a keli, since a keli is only really finalized, if you smoothed it out, if you used tools to render it into a keli, just taking a sliver of wood, even lachzis boishinov, according to the Chachamim, that's only an isur derabanan. And now the Gemara is going to explain the machlokes. Says the Gemara Rabbi Eliezer, the Ka'amar Hasam chayiv chatos. If clipping wood for a toothpick, which is chayiv chatos according to Rabbi Eliezer, so indeed, he will hold that we make a takana not to clip wood to get its fragrance midrabanan, because since if you do it for toothpick, if you take a chayiv chatos, then the chachamim made a gzeira. Rabbanan the ka'amri hasam patalavel asur, that's the word. The chachamim hold, that's the chachamim over here, that even if a person were to fashion a sliver of wood into a toothpick on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, really it's only Asr Midrabanan, it's not Asr Midoraisa, because you're only violating biblical making a utensil if you properly finish it by smoothing it, not by just taking a little piece of wood of a log. So if the Isra is only Midrabanan, so indeed, very good. That you are only allowed to break open a barrel to get out of it food. Mashma, that if your kavana is to make it into a keli, then you're going to be chayiv chatos. So Amar Rav Ashi, Kitanya, that where are we not concerned at all of your intention, that if you have an intention to make it into a keli, if your intention is to make it into a keli, you're going to be chayiv chatos. Indeed, we're going to say we're going to make a takana. However, when are we not concerned? That's only bimustaki. It's some sort of cask that is so inferior, the way Rashi says, we are certain that no one will plan to use it into a keli. It's like what we would call today a disposable. That's the heter of a disposable. No one is going to make it into a keli. So what's the takeaway of our sugya? That any type of activity, that if you do it with the intention of making it into a utensil, if that will be a isur doiraisa, then you may never make it into a keli, even if that's not your intention. The chachamim will make a gzeira. It's only where, even in the worst case scenario, with your intention, it's only an isur midrabanan. That's where we don't make the double gzeira. Chavra, this is the big sugya again, coming back to opening up boxes on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. Again, even though you're doing an act of kilkul, question is, if your intention would be, what status would it have? So let's go to Ein Binyan Bekalim. You have to know the dinim over here, how to put certain things together. But that will be the general. That's the underlying system. If there is an activity that if my kavanah is to make a keli, it's only asur midrabanan. Then if my kavanah is b'chlal not to make it into a keli, all I want to do is I want to get to the contents in it. Then it's going to be mutar lachatchila. Wherever, if my kavanah to make it into a keli would touch on an isur d'oraisa, even if my intention is not to make it into a keli, then yes, the chachamim would make a gzeira and they would say you may not do it midrabanan.
Rabbi, what did you just say? I didn't understand the Hebrew there about opening a box just to get to the contents. What did you say?
That if the type of box is such that if your intent is to make it into a proper receptacle, if that would touch a biblical prohibition, then the sages would say you may not do it, even if your intent is only to get into the contents. If when opening up whatever your box is will never lead anyone to violating a biblical violation, which is the way we rule when it comes to all of these disposable boxes that our stuff comes in. So since even if the intent would have been, oh, now I have a receptacle and you're only violating a rabbinic, now we can be lenient by saying that that's not even your intention. You don't want the receptacle. You don't want to make a receptacle. You just want to get into the contents. Then it's going to be permitted.
Okay.
It's very important. This is the source. Now there's many details to that, but I'm saying all the people that are lenient when it comes to opening up, items to get to its contents, there's a place for leniency, and that's particularly true according to everyone if you're trying to get to food, even on Shabbos. If you're trying to get to food, like you have a box of cereal. So we advocate to open it up in a way where you are ruining it. That's a lot better. You have to be careful not to tear. That means don't open it where two things are stuck together. That's one issue. Koireya. Then you have an issue of, is it going to become reusable? So if you open it up in a way where you destroy it, act of kilkul, for food, compounded with, even if your intention would have been, it would only be a rabbinic, then for sure there would be no problem at all. Okay, it's a big topic. Bottom line is, we open up bottles on Shabbos. That's because the Rebbe would open up bottles on Shabbos. There are many angles that have to be analyzed when it comes to these questions. And let's go on weiter. Going back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that umegabev min avchatzir. That this is all Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that you are allowed to gather slivers of wood, pieces of hay, not only from your house, even from the yard, like we learned. That's a chiddush. The Chachamim argue with that. No, it's even though these are items that are generally difficult to gather, one might have argued if it's out there in the yard, you never had in mind to use it. You put it out of your mind, it should be muktzah. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it's in your property, it's near your house, you can gather it. Tanach Rabbanan, megaviv min hachatzir umadlik, you are allowed to gather all of these little slivers of wood or of hay, even from your yard, not to make it into a keli, but for fuel. Why? Because Rabbi Eliezer holds shekol ma'aseh b'chatzir, anything that's in your yard automatically has the status of muchan. It's prepared for Shabbos and Yom Tov use. Now again, Shabbos you're not allowed to gather it because you can't burn on Shabbos. Ubelvad, however, don't make them into piles because it gives the appearance that you are gathering it for the weekday. However, Rab Shimon even allows you to make it into a pile. No one is allowing me to work on Yom Tov for the weekday. But if I need to make a lot of food on Yom Tov for Yom Tov, and this is my fuel, and when I gather it, I want to gather it in a way that now that I'm going to go and move into my kitchen, I'm going to have everything in one pile, you can do it. And by Michael Mifligi, Mar Savar, the Tanakama holds, that that by the act of piling it, it gives the appearance that you're trying to store it. So therefore you're not allowed to do it. Omar Savar, that's Rab Shimon. No, that if you're putting it into a pile, and then you're going to go bake and cook, so kadarto, your pot, your food, your kitchen, meichachas olav is showing that you need it for now. And if you need it for now, you can be more organized. No problem with putting it into a pile. And here we go. This is the big one-liner. Ein mitzian esaur. The Mishnah says you may not create fire. Once you have fire, you can pass it on. You may not create it on any given way, as the Mishnah point out. V'chulei. My tama, mishum the komoiled biyamtiv. Gavaldik. If you remember, we had the word moiled before. Moiled is generally understood to be a isur derabanan. We read the words in Rashi above regarding moiled, that it looks like you're doing a malacha. Like you're creating yesh ma'ayin, what we would call yesh ma'ayin, something out of nothing. So that's the shita of Rashi. You should know that the Taz, the Taz is the one that paskins that moiled here means MERCAVA patish. That means that it's one of the malachos. He understands creating fire on Yom Tov to be an isur d'oraisa. However, the other poskim understand the way moiled is normally used as an isur d'rabanan. It looks like you're doing a malach. It looks like, but it's not an actual malach. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to do it. But on Yom Tov, we can use fire for cooking, and if it's only isur d'rabanan, then amira la'akum, to make fire on Yom Tov will be mutar l'chatchila. Let's go weiter. You may not take a tile, make it white hot, to then roast something on top of it, and the question is, my ka'avad. You're not. What are you doing wrong? I'll tell you, must be. There's something that's missing. That our Mishnah is only speaking about these are brand new tiles. So what? Says Rashi on top of the Amid that when you are using this tile for the first time, what would happen? What is the percent? I don't know, but it was a substantial, even minority, that some of these tiles would crack. They would not be able to tolerate the heat that is needed for them to be used to roast on top, and therefore, that means if I'm working and it's going to turn out that my work is not effective, it broke, retroactively my effort was an unnecessary effort, and that's asur midrabanan. Now, I'm hoping that my tiles will work. So in the tiles, the quality that they had in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, it wasn't that way. If it was new, if it was never tested before, you don't know whether it's going to function or not. And therefore you may not use it. You have to harden them. In other words, even more, that whenever they would use a brand new tile for the first time, when is the tile considered a finished product that could be used to roast on top? After it was used once for roasting. In other words, the first time that you use the keli, you can view that as the gemar malacha. That's a much bigger problem. In other words, you are actually making the keli. Only there is where the Mishnah says you may not use it. But if the tile was already used once, number one, you know that the tile is hard enough, it's not going to crack. Number two, it's already considered the final product, the way the Gemara is learning, then there's absolutely nothing wrong. For you, it's Yom Tov. You're taking the tile, you're putting it on fire, and then you're taking it off the fire, and you're putting on it whatever it is that you're going to use the tile to roast, and V'shalom al Yisrael, God willing, Chavra, to be continued.